Hello and welcome to episode number 13 of the Scottish History Podcast, unlucky for some. My name is Owen Innes and once again welcome back. To those of you that are just listening to the podcast for the first time, I do recommend that you go back a number of episodes. The reason being is because you're jumping into a story kind of halfway through. This week we're going to be talking about the events of Bonnie Prince Charlie after the Battle of Culloden. Last week we talked about the Battle of Culloden itself and a little bonus episode about a man called Roderick Mackenzie. So this week we're going to be talking about Bonnie Prince Charlie and the aftermath of the Battle of Culloden. So within days of the battle itself, the dead were buried in mass graves on the site of the battle. The dead remained buried underfoot at Culloden battlefield to this particular day. Nowadays, there are remembrance markers across the whole site. These indicate the clans and the government soldiers that fought at the battle, but not where they are actually buried. This is something really for the Outlander fans. Although the great things that Outlander has done for Scotland's tourism industry and the popularisation of the Jacobites worldwide, to see the worship of the clan Fraser stone it's been a little bit sad in a way, with people regularly picnicking and things like that on the site of that particular stone, probably unaware because they've not been through the exhibition to actually know this, but probably unaware that they are currently sitting and having fun, I suppose, on a mass grave. The battle site at Culloden is not for this, it is for remembrance. It is highly seen as disrespectful, as I'm sure you can imagine, as to what actually happened at Culloden. Anyway, so after the battle, about 1,500 Highland clansmen arrived at Ruven Barracks to the south of Inverness, ready and eager to fight once again. However, very soon they received a letter from Bonnie Prince Charlie indicating that the fight was over, the uprising was done, and it was now every man for himself. By the 20th of June 1746, Bonnie Prince Charlie had reached a place called Arisaig. Arisaig is on that sort of West Highland line between Fort William and Mallaig. So Mallaig is really kind of the end of the West Highland railway line, I should say, when I refer to that West Highland line. But just before there, you've got Arisaig, you've got Morar. So Arisaig is where Bonnie Prince Charlie arrived, and subsequently you'll find it's also where he left. So by the 20th of June, that's where he'd reached Arisaig, so close to the site where he had first landed at Loch Nan Uin. He then fled to the Outer Hebrides, the island of Benbecula, in the Outer Hebrides, where he stayed until the 28th of June 1746, where the lad that was born to be king was brought over the sea to Skye. One of the prince's aides was a man called Con O'Neill. He was from County Antrim in Ireland, and he was a distant relative of a woman who had lived on the Isle of Skye and now living in a place called Uist. Her family were government supporters during the uprisings. However, she grew very sympathetic to the prince's situation. This lady's name was Flora MacDonald. Her stepfather's name was Hugh MacDonald, who was a commander in a pro-government militia on the Isle of Skye. Because of this, Flora was able to, and I must say this hesitantly, she feared what would happen to her if anybody found out that she had helped the prince. Ultimately, you'll find that out in a later bonus episode about Flora herself. But because of her stepfather, Flora was able to gain the required permits to sail a boat from Uist across to the Trotternish Peninsula on the island of Skye. Now, this is just from a couple of sources in which I've read, but Hugh MacDonald, however, allegedly already knew that the prince was on Benbecula, and apparently even advised the prince where his search parties were so that they could be avoided. Again, this is from a couple of sources on the internet. It was the first time that I'd read about it, but these sources had been around for a while, so Please feel free to fact check me on that if you wish. The permit issued indicated there would be a certain number of people on the boat. There would be 6 boatmen to crew the ship. There was 1 manservant, who ultimately was Con O'Neill, Flora MacDonald herself, and her maid. Her maid's name was Betty Burke, who was an Irish woman whom Flora had technically just met, because Betty Burke was actually Bonnie Prince Charlie in drag. A blue and white frock, if I believe, was thrown upon him as they sailed across. They arrived on Skye just north of Uig, at a place now referred to as Prince Charlie's Point, and then they headed to the reasonably large town on the Isle of Skye. It's the capital of the Isle of Skye, I suppose, Portree, where outside the current Portree Hotel, just off of the main town square, is where Flora and Charlie said their goodbyes, and they never saw each other again. And once again, there's going to be more about Flora MacDonald in a little bonus episode that I'll do, very akin to that of Roderick Mackenzie. Charlie was then heading to the neighbouring island of Rassay. However, he was told to ditch his newfound woman's disguise as he stood out a bit too much in it. So he did, and then headed across to Rassay. From there we know he came back to the mainland of Scotland and flirted around the north for a time, and despite that £30,000 reward on the prince's head, he was never betrayed by any of his loyal clansmen or clanspeople. He eventually left Scotland again from Arisaig, where he had arrived less than a year earlier. He was picked up by a French frigate and taken back to France, where he was treated as a kind of celebrity of the time, this romantic idea of going across and trying to save your country. So he arrived back in France as a little bit of a celebrity. In 1748, Charles was exiled from France as part of the Anglo-French peace agreement at the time, and he headed back to Rome. He did, however, make it back to Britain once. Fairly secretly, apart from the fact that, of course, we know all about it now. But he came back to Britain in 1750, where he claimed he was now a Protestant and would take the throne that way. But, of course, it didn't work. During this particular visit, he met and had a relationship and a child with a woman called Clementina Walkinshaw. The child was called Charlotte. Allegedly, however, Bonnie Prince Charlie had become violent, and Clementina claimed that Charles would beat her regularly. Charles may indeed have been a violent man, but on the other side, there has been proof to say that Clementina was a Hanoverian spy, and therefore, of course, again, that idea of trying to worsen his name. So I cannot say whether or not that is true. Please feel free to add your bits in the comments or an email, whatever. Please feel free to do so. And then we jump forward a little bit to 1722. Bonnie Prince Charlie marries Princess Louise of Stolberg. She herself was a teenager, but the prince was now a 50-year-old broken alcoholic. After just 8 years, she left him for a famous poet. In 1783, he then invited his daughter Charlotte to come and live with him, and he then proclaimed her as the Duchess of Albany, but this title did not give her any right of succession to the British crowns. So Charles, Edward, Louis, John, Casimir, Sylvester, Severino, Maria Stuart died in Rome on the 31st of January in 1788. He died of a stroke 1 month after his 67th birthday. His birth had been marked by a great storm that had ravished the city of Hanover. However, he never succeeded in storming back the throne of Britain to his family. He was buried first in Frascati Cathedral, where his brother Henry was bishop. But upon Henry's death in 1807, Bonnie Prince Charlie's body was exhumed and placed in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, where he was laid to rest next to his father and his brother Henry. His heart, however, remains buried at the Frascati Cathedral in a small urn under the floor. If you do ever visit Rome, I do suggest that you go to the crypts underneath St. Peter's Basilica. St. Peter's Basilica itself is an absolutely wonderful building. Highly suggest it. If you do plan on heading to the crypts, what I do suggest is that you look up the opening times. Unfortunately, with my visit there recently, I was unable to go because the queues, it was like Disneyland. It was crazy. It was about a 4-hour queue just to get into the basilica itself. I mean, it's completely free, of course, but very, very, very long queue to get in. So myself and my partner decided that we will go later. So we went one evening about, I think it was 8 or 9 p.m, something like that. No queue, straight in. But the crypts themselves close at about 4 or 5 p.m. So if you do want to go down into the crypts and see the gravesite of Bonnie Prince Charlie, Henry, and of course his father, the Old Pretender, then I suggest that you do, and make sure that you check the opening times. So folks, that once again wraps it up for another episode. I do apologise, these episodes tend to be a little bit short, and the reason being is I'm just trying to take a specific period of time before sort of moving on. The Jacobites is such a long story that I didn't want to put it all into one big long episode. But I hope that the way in which you're listening to it, be it Spotify, Amazon, Apple, or on YouTube, whichever means that you're using to listen to this particular podcast, I hope that it's been very easy to follow. So just before we wrap things up, I want to first of all thank all of those people that have signed up for the Patreon. I am absolutely amazed at the support that I'm being shown. It is phenomenal. Thank you very, very much for pledging your money to me every month. It's well, not to me, to the podcast. The money is going straight to the podcast, of course, for the help for the hosting fees, etc. A new microphone stand, it will be something in the near future as well. This one has become very, very wobbly, but that's what happens when you buy something cheap. So the Patreon has been brilliant. If you're new to the podcast and you want to support, please head across to patreon.com/Scott History Pod. So Patreon is Patreon. Alternatively, you can click the link in the description wherever it is that you are, on YouTube, whatever, you should be able to find that. Patreon.com there. I only have 2 supportive tiers. One is just £1 a month, and the other one is for £3 a month. So if you're able to spare £1 a month, I think they'll take £1.10 off of you. I think that's a Patreon thing, so Patreon get their cut. So it's £1 or £3. I'm never going to put it any higher than that. And the reason being is because, that's about the price of a pint. If you want to buy me a pint once a month, £3, that's perfect. There's some bars in Edinburgh that will charge a lot more than £3 for a pint, but there you go. So that sort of sorts that out. So please, if you can, the podcast is always going to be free. I'm never going to charge for the podcast. So this will be, so it's the same content. There's no, as the podcast grows a little bit, if someone throws me out a couple of ideas, I might do Patreon only things, but I don't really fancy doing that. I want to keep this available to everyone. Of course, we also have Spotify. We're on Apple Podcasts. I believe we're also on Amazon. I mentioned Amazon earlier. And of course, YouTube. Just go to any of these, simply type in the Scottish History Podcast. You'll find the big blue face of Robert the Bruce there. And of course, the author, Owen, you'll see underneath. So it's very, very easy to find. Same on Facebook. The Facebook thing, just search in the search bar the Scottish History Podcast. Twitter, @ScottHistoryPod. You can send me an email. That's scotthistorypod@gmail.com. And yeah, I just want to thank all of you in the last week or so that have either supported me on Patreon, sent me a message on Facebook, sent me an email. It is greatly appreciated. Of course, you know that because I've responded to every single one to say how appreciative I am. So if you are listening to this, please get in touch, post some comments down below, ask questions, give me recommendations of things that you would like to hear in the future. Anyway, folks, once again, thank you very much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.